Your brain, this 3-pound universe of electrochemical chaos, is not a stable entity. It is a battleground. Every night you lie down and surrender conscious control, and in that surrender, something unsettling happens. The self you spent all day constructing begins to dissolve. The Baltimore longitudinal study of aging tracked thousands of brains for decades, and the data shows something your conscious mind never wanted to know. It's the architecture of your identity, the medial prefrontal cortex, the hub where your sense of you resides, loses a measurable percentage of its grip during the transition from wakefulness to NREM sleep. Not by accident, by design. And when you wake up, you have to rebuild it from scratch. Here's what nobody talks about. Your identity is not a permanent structure. It is a construction site that your brain demolishes and reconstructs every single night. The neuroscientist who first measured this, using EEG caps and functional MRI scans on subjects falling asleep in a cold, humming laboratory, expected to find continuity. What they found instead was a systematic shutdown of the neural pathway responsible for self-referential thought. You've felt it. That moment when you're drifting off and your thoughts become fragmented, your sense of time collapses, and the narrative voice in your head, the one that tells you who you are, begins to stutter and fade. That's not just relaxation. That's your medial prefrontal cortex reducing its metabolic activity by 15%, measured with a precision that would have made William James stare at the ceiling. If you find yourself pausing right now, wondering how much of your own sense of self is built on a nightly lie, that curiosity is exactly the signal worth following. Subscribe if you want to keep watching your brain dismantle its own certainties, because what comes next redefines what you even means. And drop the word dissolve in the comments if you've ever felt your identity blur at the edges just before sleep took you. The ancient Greeks had a word for this: ecstasis, standing outside oneself. They believed that during sleep, the rational soul withdrew from the senses, leaving the body as an empty vessel. Aristotle wrote about this in De Anima, arguing that the essence of a person remained present but inaccessible. He was wrong about the mechanism, he was right about the experience. But here's the thing. The real discovery came when researchers at the University of California began comparing EEG recordings during the transition into sleep with baseline waking states. They noticed something strange. The resting state network, the brain's default mode, the one that generates your sense of self, does not simply fade, it reorganizes. Thomas Willis, the 17th century anatomist who first mapped the brain's ventricles, described sleep as a quieting of the spirit. He was closer to the truth than he knew. The quieting is not passive. It is an active dismantling. The part almost nobody quotes from the scientific literature is this: during stage 2 NREM sleep, the brain's capacity for autobiographical memory retrieval drops by an estimated 40% relative to wakefulness. Fox and colleagues showed this in a 2015 fMRI study of 30 subjects, all healthy young adults, none with sleep disorders. The medial prefrontal cortex, the seat of identity, simply stops talking to the hippocampus. The bridge between your memories and your sense of self is severed. And that's when the data got worse. Because if you think waking up restores the connection automatically, you would be wrong. The process of rebuilding your identity takes measurable time. Research published in Consciousness and Cognition by Nielsen and Levine in 2007 tracked 48 subjects who rated their self-concept before sleep, immediately after waking, and 90 minutes later. The stability of identity ratings dropped by 23% immediately after waking. That gap, that 30-minute window of confusion, of not feeling quite like yourself, is not a bug. It is a feature of the architecture. Your brain does not reboot like a computer. It reconstructs piece by piece. using fragmented neural templates from before you fell asleep. Remember Thomas Willis? The same mechanism he glimpsed in the 17th century, the brain's physical activity during sleep, turns out to be the switch that decides which pieces of you survive into the next morning. Synaptic pruning, the brain's nightly edit. During REM sleep, the brain does not simply replay memories, it edits them. It discards the sensory noise and strengthens the emotional core. This is the mechanism behind the phenomenon Freud called the ego in dreams. The dreaming self is a constructed fragment, not a complete identity. Freud thought this was about wish fulfillment. He was half right. The full truth is stranger. Here's what nobody expected. When neuroscientists at Harvard attached electrodes to sleep subjects and asked them to describe their sense of self during REM, waking them at precise intervals, the subjects consistently reported a dream ego that felt continuous but was not the same as their waking identity. The same person? Not exactly. The same narrative? Never. And this is where the data revealed something completely unexpected. The brain's ability to maintain a stable identity across the sleep-wake boundary depends on a specific neurotransmitter, cortisol, the stress hormone, not dopamine, not serotonin, cortisol. Your brain releases a spike of cortisol in the final hours of sleep during the transition from REM to waking. This surge activates the prefrontal cortex, reconnecting the neural pathways that were severed hours earlier. If the cortisol spike is delayed or suppressed by alcohol, by chronic stress, by a disrupted sleep cycle, your identity reconstruction fails. You wake up feeling like a stranger. This is not poetry. This is biochemistry. The Baltimore study measured this in aging populations. The same cortisol mechanism that fails in dementia patients is the one your grandfather's brain used more efficiently than yours does. Because here's the betrayal. Your modern environment, the blue light, the infinite scroll, the notifications that spike your baseline cortisols, has desynchronized your cortisol rhythm. Your brain no longer knows when to release the awakening surge. So you wake up every morning in a state of pseudo-identity, a self that feels real but lacks the synaptic reinforcement it needs. And that's when the data got worse. Galen, the Roman physician who wrote about sleep as a quieting of the spirit in the 2nd century, also observed that gladiators who slept poorly lost their sense of identity between fights. He documented this. He didn't understand the mechanism, but he saw the pattern. The same pattern appears in modern EEG studies of subjects who sleep in unfamiliar environments, what scientists call first night effect. A 2016 study in Current Biology showed that the left hemisphere of the brain remains partially awake during the first night in a new place, monitoring for threats. The medial prefrontal cortex, the identity hub, never fully disconnects. The self is stuck halfway, neither fully asleep nor fully awake. Subjects report feeling disconnected the next morning. They say it feels like they are not themselves. They are not being metaphorical. Their identity literally did not complete the nightly reconstruction. This is where most people close the study and go back to scrolling. But if you want to understand what's actually running your nervous system, stay with the next piece of evidence. It changes everything. Because the question is not whether your identity dissolves during sleep. The question is what reassembles it. And the answer is not your conscious mind. The answer is structure you cannot directly access. The narrative coherence mechanism buried in your left hemisphere's default mode network. Descartes asked whether the dreaming self was the same as the waking self. He concluded that doubt itself proved continuity. I think, therefore I am applied across states. But Descartes was wrong. The I that thinks during waking is not the same I that dreams. They share the same biological hardware, but the software is different. The waking self is constructed from autobiographical memory. The dreaming self is constructed from emotional residues. Your brain spends the first 90 minutes of sleep each night separating these two layers. It untangles the memory of what happened from the feeling of what mattered. This process, called emotional memory consolidation, requires the medial prefrontal cortex to temporarily abandon its identity function and serve as a filter instead. You've felt it, that moment in deep sleep when you cannot remember your name, your age, your face. When asked, subjects awakened from stage 3. NREM sleep cannot recall their own birthday. They cannot describe their personality. The self is not suppressed, it is absent. The ancient Egyptians believed the soul left the body during sleep and traveled the duat, the underworld. They built elaborate rituals to ensure the soul returned to the correct body. They were wrong about the cosmology. They were right about the vulnerability. You are vulnerable every single night, not to demons, to the silence between your neural pathways. But here's the beautiful part. The mechanism that dismantles your identity is the same mechanism that makes you capable of change. Because if your identity was permanent, if it survived sleep intact, unchanged, unchallenged, you could never evolve. You would be stuck with the self you built yesterday. Synaptic pruning during sleep does not just discard, it updates. Every morning, you wake up as a slightly different person. The change is small, measurable only in fMRI scans and behavioral tests. But it is real. Your brain has eliminated the neural connections that served yesterday's self and strengthened the ones that serve today's. This is the mechanism behind the phenomenon psychologists call overnight personality drift. Not because you decide to change, because your brain decided for you. A 2018 study from the University of Zurich tracked 112 subjects across 7 nights. Each morning, participants completed personality inventories. The results showed that traits like neuroticism and openness shifted by an average of 3% from day to day. Not enough to notice, but enough to measure. The changes correlated with the amount of slow-wave sleep the previous night. Your identity is a living document. Every night, your brain opens it, makes edits, and saves a new version. You never read the old version again. If you've ever woken up and felt that something fundamental shifted, a belief that no longer sits right, a fear that feels less sharp, that is not imagination. That is your brain's nightly editorial process. The part almost nobody quotes from the sleep literature is that this editing is competitive. Neural connections compete for survival during sleep. The ones most reinforced during waking hours survive. The ones neglected are pruned. Which means the self you build during the day is the self your brain will reinforce at night. If you spend the day scrolling, anxious, distracted, your brain will prune away the neural pathways for focus, for reflection, for the quiet sense of self that knows what it wants. It will strengthen the pathways for scanning, for vigilance, for the fragmented identity that jumps from notification to notification. This is not a bug. This is a mechanism your ancestors used to survive predators. Your brain evolved to strengthen the neural circuits that were active during waking hours, because in the ancestral environment, whatever occupied your waking attention was what kept you alive. If you were scanning for threats, your brain assumed threats were present. If you were focused on a single task, your brain assumed the environment was safe enough to do so. The problem is that you are no longer scanning for predators. You are scanning for dopamine hits. And your brain cannot tell the difference. So it prunes your sense of self accordingly. And this is where the data becomes a mirror. You've felt it. That sensation of walking through your day with a self that feels thinner than it used to be, less anchored, more reactive. You blame yourself. You're not disciplined enough, not focused enough. But the problem is not your willpower. The problem is your brain's nightly editing process, which has spent months or years strengthening the neural pathways of distraction and pruning the pathways of depth. Your grandfather's brain, which had no infinite scroll, no notification loops, no cortisol desynchronization, spent every night reinforcing a different set of neural connections. His self was built from sustained attention, from deep reading, from conversations that lasted hours. His brain's nightly edit strengthened those circuits. Your brain's nightly edit strengthens different circuits. Not because you are weaker, because your environment is chemically different. The proof is in your own wiring. If you felt your memory slipping or your identity fraying, this is not normal aging. It is the cost of a life your brain was not designed for. And the science is about to show you what your ancestors did differently. They did not have perfect sleep hygiene. They did not meditate. But their environment did not hijack the pruning mechanism. Every night, as you drift toward unconsciousness, your brain begins the work of dismantling the self you just built. It separates the memories from the meaning. It prunes the connections you did not use. It strengthens the ones you did. And when the cortisol spike arrives in the final hours of sleep, it reassembles a version of you that is slightly different from the version that lay down. This is not a flaw. This is survival. But it is survival in a world that no longer exists. You carry your grandfather's hardware, but the software running on it, the data you feed it every waking hour, is entirely different from what his brain expected. His brain spent every night reinforcing a self that knew how to sit still, how to think one thought deeply, how to remember where the water source was and which berries were safe to eat. Your brain spends every night reinforcing a self that knows how to scroll. And then you wake up and wonder why you feel like a stranger. You are not a stranger. You are a reconstruction. Every morning, you rebuild yourself from a template that was edited overnight. And the editing decisions are not made by the you that exists during waking hours. They are made by a mechanism that evolved before language, before self-awareness, before the concept of identity existed. Your grandfather's ghost is running the hardware. And the ghost does not understand the digital world. The loop is not your fault. The mechanism that dismantles and rebuilds your identity is ancient. It was not designed for notifications. It was designed for saber-toothed tigers. The problem is not that your brain is failing. The problem is that your brain is succeeding at strengthening the wrong self. The scientist who first described this, the one who watched fMRI scans flicker as subjects drifted into sleep, saw the medial prefrontal cortex go dark and then flicker back to life, named the phenomenon, and then stopped publishing. He told colleagues it was too unsettling. He worried that if people understood that their identity was reconstructed rather than continuous, they would lose the sense of self that holds society together. He was probably right. He was definitely wrong to hide it. Because the truth of your dissolving and reforming self is not a curse. It is the only mechanism by which growth is possible. Every morning, you have the chance to wake up as a slightly different person. The choice is not whether your identity will change. It is whether you will guide the change. The editing happens whether you direct it or not. Your brain will prune neural connections based on whatever data you fed it the day before. If that data was noise, the self it rebuilds will be a self built for noise. If that data was signal, the self it rebuilds will be a self built for signal. You have more control than you think, not over the mechanism. That is automatic, unconscious, indifferent, but over the input, over what you feed the pruning machine. And this is where the shift happens. From shame to clarity, from blaming yourself for a self that feels frayed, to understanding that your personal identity was always a nightly construction and you have been building it with the wrong materials. If this moment of clarity resonates, if you want to learn how to feed the pruning machine with signal instead of noise, so might subscribe to stay with the rest of this unraveling. Because the next layer of this research shows you exactly which inputs your brain expects and how to give them back. And in the comments, type signal if you're ready to stop feeding the wrong self. But here's the unsettling part. You cannot directly observe the self your brain is building. You only experience the result every morning when the cortisol spike reconnects your prefrontal cortex and a new version of you emerges. You have never met the person you were last night, and you never will. If that thought lands differently now than it did at the beginning of this video, that is because your brain has been editing itself even as you listened. And if you want to control what the next edit looks like, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because the mechanism is ancient, but the manual is something we are only now learning to write. Leave the word rebuild in the comments if you are ready to take the editing process out of the dark.